Cataclysm of Rome, Part 3, The Holy Roman Empire. In Part 2 of this series, The Cataclysm of Rome, we discovered how, in the late 6th century, the Byzantine emperors, in contract with the Arabs, created the religion of Islam to be its militant wing. Islam then swept over the Christian lands of the Eastern Kingdom, conquering them in the name of Islam, and growing an ever-strengthening army that was able to hold power in those lands covertly for the Catholic Church, and to remove it from the hands of organic Christianity, which had spread over the world like wildfire since the time of Jesus Christ and the beginning of the Kingdom of God. In this video, we will explore the next steps that the emperors and popes took to regain control of all the lands that had formerly been ruled by Rome, specifically in Europe. With North Africa, Persia, Arabia, and Egypt secured by the Muslims, they now turned their attention towards regaining Italy and the European lands that had been Christianized by apostolic missionaries, instead of adhering to the dogmas of the Roman Catholic Church. We will explore some interesting alliances and relationships that the popes made that gave them power that they needed to regain control in these, quote, barbaric lands of the Franks, the Saxons, the Vikings, and other peoples. This will all lead to the rebirth of a sadistic and pagan power structure, with the Pope at its head, a phoenix that rises from the ashes of the Dark Ages, the Holy Roman Empire. We will, again in this video, drink from a fire hose, so to speak. We are going over information that spans hundreds of years of history and territory from Europe to Africa. It is important to focus on the peoples and partnerships that are built over the centuries, and also remember that this time frame of history is one of the most disputed in terms of chronology. Some light will also be shed on the possibilities of what many call phantom time in this video. Let's get started. Enter the Khazars. You might think, why are we looking into the Khazars in a video on the Catholic Church? Well, the answer is because, contrary to most people's understanding, the Khazarian kingdom became inextricably linked with the Roman emperors during this time period. This relationship is the first that we need to explore to understand the coming centuries, what we call the Dark Ages. By the early 700s, Islam had retaken the southern and eastern kingdom back for the Byzantine Empire. By the way, the Byzantine Empire was the Roman Empire. Once Rome was lost to the Arian Christian Lombards in 568, only the Byzantine Empire remained. Also called the Eastern Roman Empire, the kingdom was now headquartered in Constantinople in what we now call Turkey. This is a map of the Byzantine Empire in the time of the 7th century. These maps show the retaking of the southern and eastern kingdom at the hands of the Muslim hordes. This map shows Constantinople as well as the lands that we will be discussing for the most part in this video. To the northeast of the Byzantine kingdom, the Khazarian kingdom loomed. It controlled the east-west trade route linking the Orient and the north-south trade route linking the Arabs and the Slavs with Byzantium. The Khazarians began to cause some problems for the Byzantine emperor. For instance, in 711, a revolt aided by the Khazars broke out in Kherson on the northern coast of the Black Sea. This is the area of modern-day Ukraine. Having been exiled to Kherson, the Byzantine emperor Justinian II made a truce with the Khazars to help him regain the Byzantine throne in Constantinople. He sealed the truce by marrying the daughter of the Khazarian Khagan, Basir. Her original Khazar name is unknown, but Justinian renamed her as Theodora. The only way that this deal would have been struck is if the Khazarian king Basir would be granted some power in the Byzantine kingdom. It is only natural. Following suit, Emperor Constantine V in 732 married another of Bihar's daughters named Zitzak, whom he promptly baptized and renamed Irene. One interesting side note, the modern Hasidic Jewish practice of oral suction circumcision, where blood from a baby's circumcision is consumed by rabbis, called the metzitza b'peh. You can see the relationship between the words zitzak and metzitza, showing a direct etymological connection between them. This shows that the modern practice of blood drinking is directly connected to Khazarian Judaism. But I digress. Constantine V and Irene, or Zitzak, had a son Leo IV, who became Byzantine emperor in 775 and was known as Leo the Khazar. Irene came to be called Irene of Athens and actually ruled beyond the reign of Constantine V. When Leo IV died in 780, their son Constantine VI became emperor at age 9 with his mother Irene as his regent. You can correctly assume that she was the one in control of the empire at this time. In 792, Constantine VI named Irene, or Zitzak, as Empress of the empire. In 797, Empress Irene had Constantine captured, blinded, and imprisoned, and she took total control of the Byzantine Empire for herself. Now, another note. Historians now disconnect the supplanter Zitzak or Irene from her further rule, claiming that the Irene of Athens was not Zitzak the Khazarian, who married Leo IV and subsequently took control in Byzantium. But this seems to be historically unclear, and more likely that both Irene Zitzak and Irene of Athens were in fact one and the same. Rather than believing that there were two coincidentally named Irenes from different places in back-to-back imperial reigns with the same family, it seems more plausible to assume that they were the same Irene. Regardless, you can see how the Byzantium and Khazarian kingdoms became intertwined during the 8th century. Writings from the 9th and 10th centuries give testimony that the Khazars also adopted Judaism in the same time period. Sviatoslav, the ruler of Kiev, launched a campaign against the Khazars in 965. Khazar power was crushed at that time. But by this time, the Khazarians were intertwined with the Holy Roman Empire and the Papacy. As late as the 16th century, we see that Pope Leo X showed special favors to the Jews and allowed them to establish a Hebrew printing press in Rome. This press produced manuscripts of the Babylonian Talmud to be distributed to Jews throughout the world. Holy Roman Emperors. The name Holy Roman Emperor is a bit of a convoluted misnomer, as the emperors of the Dark Ages in many cases were not holy, nor were they Roman, and they were not even official emperors in most cases. This period in history is cloudy and obscure, likely with good reason. We will talk more about why that may be later on. There are two specific emperors I want to focus on for the purposes of this video, as they were likely the most influential emperors during the Dark Ages, no matter who you ask. These are Charlemagne and Otto the Great. In the year 753, the Lombards threaten Rome, and they take Ravenna. Pope Stephen II flees to France because of this, and makes a deal to grant legitimacy to Pepin if he would help repel the Lombards. Pepin, or Charlemagne's father, was anointed by the Pope as the chosen of the Lord, while his sons Charlemagne and Carloman were also anointed by the Pope as royal heirs to Western Europe. Pepin moved his military to Italy to protect it against the Lombards in 755 and 756 AD. And in 756, the donation of Pepin granted the papacy a strip of land in northern and central Italy. In 768, Pepin dies, and the kingdom is now divided between Charlemagne and his brother Carloman. In 774, Charlemagne joins battle and takes Pavia in northern Italy back from the Lombards to reassert papal authority over the lands that Pepin the Short, his father, had given to the papacy in the donation of Pepin. The Lombard king Desiderius surrenders to Charlemagne. Charlemagne annexes Lombardy in the name of the Pope. During this time, Charlemagne also annexed the land that is now Germany, causing mass killings, mass deportations, and making broken truces to get his way. The population in those lands was forced to accept Catholic Christianity. In 780, another campaign against the Saxons in Germany was launched by Charlemagne, and again the Saxons were forced into mass baptisms to convert to Catholic Christianity. In 782, the Massacre of Verdun was an event during the Saxon Wars where the Frankish king Charlemagne ordered the death of 4,500 Saxons. This occurred in October of 782 in what is now Lower Saxony, Germany. This history has caused the Germans and some Britons to typically hold a severely negative view of Charlemagne as a historical figure. The National Socialist Party in Germany initially portrayed Charlemagne as an enemy of Germany, a French ruler who had worked to take away the freedom and native religion of the German people. Now we need to look at Otto the Great. After putting down a brief civil war among the rebellious duchies, Otto defeated the Magyars at the Battle of Lechfeld in 955 AD, thus ending the Hungarian invasion of Western Europe. The victory against the pagan Magyars earned Otto a reputation as a savior of Christendom and secured his hold over the kingdom. By 961, Otto had conquered the kingdom of Italy. Following the example of Charlemagne's coronation as the, quote, Emperor of the Romans, Otto was crowned emperor in 962 by Pope John XII in Rome. And that same year, Otto entered into an agreement with Pope John XII, called the Diploma Ottonianum Privilegium Ottonianum, which confirmed the donation of Pepin, of Charlemagne's father, which established the papal state. This meant that the papacy now owned and controlled land again in Italy, and is the precursor to the land agreements that secure even the Vatican City to the papacy in the present day. Otto's agreement with the papacy established the rule by which all future emperors would relate to the Pope. These emperors embodied the military might that would keep these lands of Europe under the control of the papacy. Rebirth of the Roman Empire. With the renewed control over the lands of Western Europe, the retaking of the lands of Italy from the Lombards, and the establishment of the papal state in Italy, as well as the re-established bonds between the popes and the emperors, the papacy became something altogether much more like its historical predecessor, the Roman Empire. This was now called the Holy Roman Empire. Born out of the ashes of the Dark Ages, emerging with a second iron-fisted rule over the known world, we can see this as a rebirth of the Roman Empire itself. This idea of the rebirth of the Roman Empire is symbolized in the crest of the Holy Roman Empire, the double-headed eagle, both the old and the new Roman Empire. And this should also give you an understanding as to why the elite of Europe used the symbol of the flaming phoenix rising from the ashes in their rituals. This is the 2012 London Olympics closing ceremony, where you see a phoenix rising from the ashes.
And arriving from the sky is the prima ballerina. will now do so. It has burned so brightly here.
The popes of the Dark Ages were all working towards reviving something, bringing something back that had been lost. Retaking Jerusalem. The First Crusade started as a grassroots pilgrimage of Christians from France and Germany, the Franks and the Germanics. Pope Gregory VII had called twice for a crusade to the Holy Lands, specifically in recovering the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, said to have been Christ's tomb. He said that Eastern Christians were suffering and that Western Christians had a moral obligation to help them. In 1095, Byzantine Pope Urban II convened the Council of Piacenza. The council addressed the investiture controversy, which was really the attempt of the Catholic Church to have power to install bishops on its own throughout Europe and the Mediterranean. Byzantine Emperor Alexius I Komnenos sent ambassadors to this church council of Piacenza to seek the aid of the Western Christian knights against the Seljuk Turks that had been invading the Byzantine lands for some time, specifically the Anatolia, or Turkey. Pope Urban gave a speech on the 27th of November of 1095 at the conclusion of this council, where he summoned the attending nobility and the people to wrest the Holy Land and the Eastern churches generally from the control of the Seljuk Turks, or Muslims. Urban promised forgiveness and pardon for all of the past sins of those who would fight to reclaim the Holy Land from the Muslims and to free these Eastern churches. This was the speech that triggered the Crusades and turned them from a pilgrimage into a military campaign of conquest. Were the Crusades a true attempt to regain the Holy Lands for some altruistic, righteous goal? Or was this possibly a backhanded way not only to take control of the most holy site of the three largest world religions, but also to gain control of the most active trade routes in the world between Europe and the Far East? As you evaluate the actions of the Catholic Church and the Papacy, if you will look with the perspective of a struggle for power, everything will fall into place. The motive matches the outcome every single time. The Papacy and the Evil of the Dark Ages. It's interesting to me that the times that the Catholic historians call the Dark Ages actually seem to be the times in which organic Christianity, not Catholic Christianity, ruled over the majority of the known world in the lands of Europe. All of the barbarian or Germanic lands were Christian, but not Catholic Christian. This is a map of Byzantium. These are the people that wrote the histories of this time period. These are the people that curated the history that both you and your children were taught all through your years of schooling. So it follows suit that they would write the histories to favor their view of those histories, seeing the Dark Ages as a miserable time period, but only miserable to the Catholic Church because they didn't control the European lands. As we established, after the times of Charlemagne and Otto the Great, from about 875 forward, the popes claimed the right to confirm emperors, and many popes during this time were heralded as bishops not just of Rome, but, quote, bishops of the world. The history of the Catholic Church is also filled with such corruption in the papacy that you could almost say it is legendary. Here are a few of the popes that have given the papacy its bad name. Adrian II, John VIII, and Marinus, popes between 867 and 884, these were the first of the dark popes of the time frame of the 9th to the 11th centuries, called by historians the, quote, midnight of the Dark Ages. Popes like these began to be known for bribery, corruption, immorality, and bloodshed. John VIII would pay bishops to twist Christian doctrines. He punished people by forcing them to commit assassinations for him. He was called a monster of blood and cruelty. Sergius III, from 904 to 911, had a mistress named Marozia. She and her sister and mother Theodora had many illicit affairs and raised their bastard children to sit on the papal throne. The 19th century Protestants called this period a pornocracy and the rule of harlots. John X, in 914 to 928, was brought from Ravenna to Rome and made pope by Theodora for the convenient gratification of her passions. But he was smothered to death by her daughter, Marozia, who then raised one of her own bastard sons to become the pope in his place. John XI, in 931, was a bastard son of Pope Sergius III and Marozia. Marozia's bastard sons were appointed as the next 4 popes in a row. John XII, in 955 to 963, became the pope at age 18. It was said that he was guilty of most every crime. He violated virgins and widows alike and turned the papal palace into a brothel. He was accused of murder, perjury, sacrilege, and incest with his own sisters by the Emperor Otto the Great, who excommunicated him from the papacy. It is said by many historians, in contrast to the claims of the Catholic Church, that this line of bastard popes broke the apostolic succession of papal authority forever, and that it could never be restored. The historian Johann Mosheim says in reference to the 10th century, quote, "The history of the Roman pontiffs that lived in this century is a history of so many monsters and not of men, and exhibits a horrible series of the most flagitious, tremendous, and complicated crimes, as all writers, even those of the Romish communion, unanimously confess." Boniface VII, in 984 to 985, murdered Pope John XIV. He took the papal throne by giving away stolen money to secure his position. The Bishop of Orleans called him and his descendants monsters of guilt, reeking in blood and filth, the Antichrist sitting in the temple of God. Benedict VIII, in 1012 to 1024, simply bought the office of the Pope for himself. John XIX, in 1024 to 1033, also bought the papacy. He claimed to have passed through all of the clerical degrees necessary for the position in one single day. Benedict IX, from 1033 to 1045, was made the pope as a teenager, and soon he had committed murders and adulteries in broad daylight and robbed Christian pilgrims. The people drove him out of Rome multiple times, and he returned each time. He sold his position as pope to his successor. Desiderius describes him as, quote, "abandoned to all manner of vice, a successor of Simon the sorcerer, and not of Simon the apostle." Gregory VI, from 1045 to 1046, had 2 rival popes, Benedict IX and Sylvester III. Rome swarmed with assassins hired by each of these popes. Christian pilgrims were violated and robbed, and the churches were desecrated with bloodshed. This adultery and fornication of the clergy degenerated into incest and other abominations of the grossest kind. Some priests, according to the Council of Mentz in 888, had sons by their own sisters. In the 10th and 11th centuries, concubines were openly held by the clergy, and it was regarded by the popes and prelates as a far less crime to keep a concubine than to marry a wife. They would say, any person, clergyman or layman, according to the Council of Toledo in its 17th canon, who has not a wife but a concubine, is not to be repelled from the communion if he be content with his concubine. The First Council of Toledo was actually held in 400 AD, but these popes used Canon 17 to justify their actions. It said that if a Christian has a believing wife and also a concubine, he may not be admitted to communion, but if he has no wife and only one concubine, he may be admitted. Fornication, therefore, was sanctioned by the Spanish Council in Toledo and kept by the Roman pontiffs and the canon law. Fornication of this manner was in the clergy not only tolerated, but preferred to matrimony. The Jesuits granted that concubinage was less sinful, less aggravated than marriage. And ecclesiastics, they would say, rather than marry, should, according to this precious divine, keep a concubine. During these dark ages, the scriptures were almost entirely unknown, not only by the laity, but even among the great majority of the clergy. Those of the priests who had some acquaintance with the sacred books labored hard to conceal it from the eyes of the people, especially since it so plainly condemned their vicious lives and their anti-scriptural doctrines and ceremonies. It is to be remembered also during these dark ages that the forged decretals and spurious donation of the Emperor Constantine were universally received as genuine and constantly appealed to in proof of the assumptions of the popes. This donation of Constantine was a forged Roman imperial decree by which the 4th century Emperor Constantine was said to have transferred authority over Rome and the Western Roman Empire to the Pope himself. It is generally agreed that it was probably composed in the 8th century, and it was used especially by the popes throughout that time period and even into the 13th century to claim papal authority over the lands of Western Europe. In John Dowling's book from 1807 called The History of Romanism, he says this: "The celebrated false decretals and the donation of Constantine, which appeared at about the close of the 8th century, and by which, during the whole of 3 centuries of this midnight of the world, the arrogant pretensions of the pontiffs were established and maintained. The object of these decretals, as they were called, was to persuade the multitude that in the first ages of the Church, the bishops of Rome were possessed of the same spiritual majesty and authority that they now assumed. They consisted of a pretended collection of rescripts and decrees of various bishops of Rome from the 2nd to the 5th centuries, and other forged acts, published with great ostentation and parade in the 9th century, with the name prefixed of Isidore, Bishop of Seville, to make the world believe that they had been collected by that learned prelate some 2 or 3 centuries before." Excommunication and interdict became main tools of the papacy during this time period to assert their control over the population. Dowling continues in his book, saying, "This was the mainspring of the machinery that the clergy set in motion, the lever by which they moved the world. From the moment that these interdicts and excommunications had been tried, the powers of the earth might be said to have existed only by sufferance. It is said that the only thing that could have brought and did bring the people out of this age of darkness was the invention of the printing press, the spread of information, where the Bible was able to be delivered to every home and every person in the land. This and the Protestant Reformation are what brought the people out of the dark ages of popery." Owning the big three: Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. Over the centuries since the Dark Ages, the Catholic Church has solidified its hidden hand behind the 3 largest religions on the earth. Christianity is openly ruled from the papal throne. Agreements and connections to Islam are maintained through secret communications between the Pope and the highest-ranking Muslim imams. The most affluent Khazarian Jews have continued their symbiotic relationship with the papacy for protection in exchange for control of financial systems throughout the world. Catholicism has Christianity in its pocket. The Catholic ecumenical movement has enveloped Christianity across the entire world, including throughout Protestant denominations. Through the ecumenical teachings of Billy Graham,
that he is who he claims to be.
Robert Schuller,
Our fathers, God, to thee, author of liberty, to thee.
Rick Warren,
I do believe what Chris said. I believe that you're not an accident.
Rob Bell,
of what it means to be a human being. We're fragile and vulnerable. We come from the dust.
Stephen Furtick,
will I leave you, and never will I forsake you. The Greek word.
Christianity has been pushed to a place of tolerance for the Catholic faith, and, to an extent, the supremacy of the Pope. Most Protestants, though not Catholic in practice, feel that the Pope is an authority figure in Christendom. Islam is also under control of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church, continuously throughout the last century, has realigned itself with Islam. We see the popes in multiple photo opportunities with Muslim imams. Judaism is also to some extent controlled by the Catholic Church. We see in this article, last week, the Pontifical Commission for Religious Relations with Jews issued a solemn renunciation. The Catholic Church neither conducts nor supports any specific institutional mission work directed towards Jews. This statement was taken as blithe reassurance that, in the words of a Slate headline, Jews can go to heaven too. In the National Catholic Reporter, we see this article that says, underscoring the close ties between Christianity and Judaism and calling Holocaust denial madness, Pope Francis told an interviewer that inside every Christian is a Jew. Dave Bateman claims that Pope Francis is actually a Jewish agent. A former Utah tech executive and prominent GOP donor said Tuesday that he believed Pope Francis was secretly a Jewish agent installed to help distribute the COVID-19 vaccine around the world in an effort to create totalitarian rule. Everyone or all religions are included in the Catholic Church or in the Catholic reign of order. In this article, Pope Francis assures atheists you don't have to believe in God to go to heaven. He says, "You ask me if the God of the Christians forgives those who don't believe and who don't seek the faith. I start by saying, and this is the fundamental thing, that God's mercy has no limits if you go to him with a sincere and contrite heart. The issue for those who do not believe in God is to obey their conscience. Sin, even for those who have no faith, exists when people disobey their conscience." So according to Pope Francis, all it takes for atheists to go to heaven is to have a sincere conscience. This is the heart of ecumenism. No doctrines, no barriers between these religions, no heresies. Everyone, religious or not, is welcome. Those of you that have attended Protestant churches in America will know this concept very well. Get people into the church, regardless of their lifestyle. Show them a concert. Give them a cup of coffee. Shake their hands and welcome them all in. Ecumenism at its finest. High strangeness. To get the point of this section, I'm going to go through a short timeline of events. just some random events that seem to have a lot in common with one another throughout this time period. In 536, it was claimed to have been the worst year in history, a volcanic winter where daylight didn't even shine for most of the year. In 541, we had the plague of Justinian, which was actually found to be the bubonic plague or the Black Death. In 598, Pope Gregory I writes a letter saying that the church had a duty to protect the Jews despite their condemnation of Christ. In 610, we have the rise of Islam. In 703, Emperor Justinian II marries Theodora of Khazaria. In 726, Emperor Constantine V marries Zitzak of Khazaria. In 756, the Papacy is granted land in Italy. In 775, Leo IV, the Khazar, becomes Byzantine emperor. In 797, Khazarian Irene, or Zitzak, becomes the empress of the Byzantine Empire. In 860, the Khazarian kingdom accepts Judaism and marries into the Byzantine Empire and the Papacy. And at about this same time, the writing of the Babylonian Talmud was completed. In 1099, the conclusion of the First Crusade at the Siege of Jerusalem occurred. In 1100, we see the emergence of Kabbalah as a religion. The writings of the Bashir, Nachmanides, and the Zohar all occurred in the 1200s. Seeing all of these Khazarian Jewish coincidences all throughout this time period seems to be a little bit more than coincidence, that there was a very intentional involvement with the Byzantine Empire by the Khazarians at this time. And as we see, the Khazarians have accepted Judaism, and the Talmud, the Kabbalah, is written at this time period, and all emerges within just a few hundred years. Another strange coincidence that we see in this time period is that relating to the Black Death or the bubonic plague. In history, the Black Death has only occurred 3 times. The first of these was in 542, the so-called Plague of Justinian. It threatened the entire known world, killing up to 1/5 of the population, nearly 50 million people. The second occurrence, and most well known, is that in 1346, when the plague started in Crimea and killed nearly half of Europe's population by the time it was finished. The third occurrence in 1894 began in China and spread throughout China and India, killing 15 million people total. Now, it's interesting that in the history of the first plague pandemic in 542, the historian Procopius suggested that Justinian I may have actually created the plague himself. It's also interesting that this is the time period during which the Khazarians were becoming involved in the Byzantine Empire. Now, during the second plague pandemic in 1346, it's not well known, but at that time, the Europeans started to think that Jews were the cause of the Black Death plague. People noticed in general that the Jews were not dying from the plague like normal Europeans were. And so they ended up rising up and killing thousands of Jews in retaliation, saying that the Jews had poisoned their water supplies and caused the plagues themselves throughout Europe. So was the Black Death, the bubonic plague, just a random strain of virus out of the Eastern world that swept through the European nations? Or was it perhaps, in both cases, a well thought out plan of extermination, perhaps even by the same group of people, 2 different times in history? Another thing to consider during this time period is that there are historians that question whether Charlemagne, whose reign was from 768 to 814 AD, and the subsequent Carolingian dynasty, were they even real? Phantom time proponents do not think they were. Historian Heribert Illig proposes that Charlemagne did not exist, but was instead an idealistic king or emperor created by the papacy to gain legitimacy throughout Europe. And judging by all the forged documents that were used by these popes to gain legitimacy, it seems to reason they could have also fabricated kings like this and histories. Heribert Illig also hypothesizes that there was a conspiracy by the Holy Roman Emperor Otto III and Pope Sylvester II to fabricate the AD or Anno Domini calendar dating system in order to place their reign at the special year of AD 1000, which would have been the start of the millennial kingdom, and then to rewrite history to legitimize Otto's claim to the Holy Roman Empire. This hypothesis would basically remove 300 years from our timeline, putting us currently at about the year 1724 since Christ was born. I do feel that this theory is good and well supported by evidence in archaeology and other disciplines. The main thing to recognize here, whether this theory is true or not, is that the papacy was desperate to consolidate power in Europe. The only way it could do this was by using their religious authority and combining that with military might of kings to reconquer all the lost lands of the Roman Empire, and in many cases, to lie about them. Catholicism or paganism. Original apostolic Christianity was quite simple. It was centered around Christians gathering together for praise and worship and to build each other up. There was a loose structure of a pastor or teacher, deacons, and the lay people of the churches. But the authority of each church was Christ himself. No church had authority over another one. They were autonomous. The church grew organically throughout Europe. There were no church buildings to speak of. There is something sobering about the practices, however, of the Catholic Church. When we step back and examine the different rituals of the papacy, we see some amazing correlations with other ancient religions. We see the temples of the ancient pagan cultures becoming the churches of the Catholic religion. The priests of the Mesopotamian gods became the bishops of the Catholic Church. Confessions in the Catholic Church are made to priests, when the Bible plainly says that we are all priests and that Jesus is our high priest under God. Everything in the Catholic Church is done with ritual. The only rituals Christ participated in was baptism by immersion and the Passover feast. Sexual corruption is so common in the Catholic Church among priests and bishops that it almost seems to be the rule and not the exception. Since Catholics believe that the wine of the Eucharist becomes the actual blood of Christ, there is a strong connection to the blood-drinking ancient pagans in honor of their deities.
Confiteur de omnipotenti, Beate Mariae Semper Virgini, Beatum Celi Arcangelo, Beatione Baptiste, Sanctis Apostolis Petro et Paulo, Omnibus Sanctis et Tibi Pater, quia peccavinimis cogitatione verbo et opere, mea culpa, mea exima culpa. Ideo precor Beatam Mariam Semper Virginem, Beatum Celi Arcangelum.
Catholics worship the Blessed Virgin Mary, which was never commanded by Christ.
Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
And seems exactly like the goddess worship of the ancient Roman cults. The practice of covering yourself with ashes and weeping on the vernal equinox for Ash Wednesday. Is similar in form and in timing to the practice of weeping for the ancient Babylonian god Tammuz or Baal. This practice was explicitly condemned by the Bible in Ezekiel 8:14. Early Christians celebrated the resurrection of Christ, the Passover lamb, at the same time that Jews had celebrated Passover. The Roman Catholic Church changed both the schedule of this celebration to be close to the spring equinox and named it Easter, which derives its name from the Babylonian goddess Astarte. This is why fertility is a part of the celebration with rabbits and eggs in honor of the goddess. The Roman Catholic Church made Christmas to coincide with the winter solstice, which was the time that the pagan holiday Saturnalia was originally celebrated. This was a time of the loss of inhibitions, of feasts and excessive gluttony in every sense. While the practices definitely have the stench of paganism, also we can see from the progression of pagan idol worship through the ancient religions that all the major ancient gods and goddesses were based on the idea of the sun and the moon. In Mesopotamia, the sun god was Tammuz, and the moon goddess was Inanna. In Babylon, Dagon was the sun, and Lilith or Ishtar was the moon. In Egypt, Osiris was the sun, and Isis was the moon. In Greece, Dionysus was the sun, and Aphrodite the moon. In Rome, Adonis or Zeus was the sun, and Venus was the moon. The sun is the male or the phallus, while the moon is the female receiver. Catholicism takes and uses the image of the sun in much of its iconography. Islam uses the image of the moon as its representative symbol. As you know from our last video, the religion of Islam was created at the hands of the Roman emperors and the Catholic Church, a perfect symbolic counterpart to Catholicism. In the 1807 book, History of Romanism, Baptist pastor John Dowling tells us about the papacy's stance on the centers of pagan worship. Pope Gregory, as before mentioned, wrote to Augustine, now raised to the dignity of Archbishop, directing him, as we are informed by the Venerable Bede, not to destroy the heathen temples of the Anglo-Saxons, but only to remove the images of their gods, to wash the walls with holy water, to erect altars and deposit relics in them, and so convert them into Christian churches. And this not only to save the expense of building new ones, but that the people might more easily be prevailed upon to frequent those places of worship to which they had been accustomed. He directs him further to accommodate the Christian worship as much as possible to those of the heathen, that the people might not be so much startled at the change. And in particular, he advises him to allow the Christian converts, on certain festivals, to kill and eat a great number of oxen to the glory of God, as they had formerly done to honor the devil. So in this way, pagan worship was never done away with by the Catholic Church, but instead simply absorbed into the Church's practices. This was done to appease the people and allow the continuance of their traditional pagan practices instead of conformity to the practices of the apostles, which were written in the Scriptures. It is worth mentioning also that the Catholic Church has always been rife with sexual corruption, mainly centered around the papacy and the leadership of the Church. We have already talked about the debauchery of the papacy in the Middle Ages and following into the Renaissance period, but even in modern times, the Church struggles to keep its head above water in a sea of sexual corruption by its leadership. The Archdiocese of New York is currently under a years-long litigation of over 1,500 abuse cases that span the last 60 years. Over 100 clergy have been allegedly involved in child sexual abuse within the church walls. It is also interesting that Catholic churches seem to have no shortage of art that may depict the sexual abuse of children. Nuns used crucifixes to rape girls during decades of abuse carried out by clergy in France's Catholic Church that saw attacks on 330,000 children covered by a veil of silence, as a damning report finds. And Pope Francis himself has been seen wearing an outfit with the boy love pedophilia symbol on its lapel. This was at the, quote, Holy Mass of the World Day on January 27th of 2019 at Campo San Juan Pablo in Panama. Many testimonies have also come out in recent years about the Vatican being at the center of a worldwide pedophile and child sacrifice ring. A former member of Octopus, a criminal drug cartel in the Netherlands, and other witnesses have stated that child sacrifices occurred regularly in the Vatican, catacombs of the Catholic cathedrals, private estates, groves, and government military bases in Belgium, Holland, Spain, Australia, Ireland, France, England, and the United States. I encourage you to visit the website 50voices.org to learn more and hear from victims' own mouths the stories of their ritual abuse at the hands of these traffickers. All of this evidence for the corruption of the papacy and for the complete similarity of the Roman Catholic Church with pagan religion, it must make us wonder if perhaps the Catholic Church is simply a front for an orthodox pagan religion that has more in common with the Canaanites of the time of Moses and Joshua than it does with Christ or the apostles who founded the Christian Church. Conclusions. We have now seen how the papacy struggled to regain power in Europe, even after amassing an Islamic army to help them take back the lands of Palestine, Persia, Arabia, and Africa. A combination of alliances, forged documents, treachery, and deals with mighty military kings helped the papacy regain the footing that it had lost during the spread of the true Christianity of Christ and the apostles throughout the known world. We have seen now also how the Khazars got involved with the papacy, intermingling themselves with the Byzantine emperors through marriage and military alliance to protect their kingdom and gain power throughout the Byzantine Empire. We saw that the Crusades were started by the popes and turned from a pilgrimage into a military retaking of Jerusalem and an all-out war against the Muslims and Jews by the Christians. We have seen how the Catholic Church is about as close as you can get to a pagan religion in its symbolism and its practices, and that it is either corrupt from the top down or is simply practicing its worship of pagan deities in secret behind closed doors, at the expense of trafficked children. With all that we know, I want to ask you, do you know who we have been studying this whole time? Whose hidden hand was moving through this history with the evil popes and the emperors that made it all possible? It was Satan himself, of course. You have just seen how the hand of Satan and his dark forces moved the popes and emperors to reconstitute the Roman Empire from the ashes of its fall. They rebuilt it not into an overt military power, but as the one religion to rule them all, with control of the three biggest religions in the world, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. This is the platform from which Satan planned to launch his conquest of the world under one rule, one government, one theocracy to blanket the entire human race. In the next and final part of this series, we will take a broad look at how everything we have covered in the first three parts fits together into history. What do we see when we take a step back to the 10,000-foot view and see it all playing out on the stage of history? A lot of things will become very clear when we do this. Our timeline may become quite a bit clearer. So thank you for your time watching, and be on the lookout for the final video in the series, The Cataclysm of Rome Part 4, Fixing Our Timeline.